Welcome back to Golden Age Mysteries, where America's forgotten secrets still echo through time. I'm your storyteller, and tonight we continue our Small Town Secrets series with a story that transformed the sleepy farming community of Cedar Falls, Iowa, in the bitter winter of 1958. Picture this. It's 11:47 p.m. on a February night so cold that even the bravest souls have retreated behind locked doors and drawn curtains. The phone rings in the Henderson house on Maple Street. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson, a 67-year-old widow, answers with trembling hands. The voice on the other end speaks just 4 words. "Your time is up." The line goes dead. 3 hours later, Eleanor Henderson is found dead in her kitchen, apparently from a heart attack. But this was just the beginning. Over the next 2 weeks, 7 more residents of Cedar Falls would receive similar calls, and by the end of February 1958, 3 more would be dead. What started as a cruel prank had become something far more sinister, a mystery that would reveal dark secrets buried beneath the snow-covered streets of this quiet Iowa town, and prove that sometimes the most dangerous predators are those who kill without ever laying a hand on their victims.
Let me take you back to Cedar Falls in February 1958, when Eisenhower was president and small farming communities like this one represented the backbone of America's heartland. Cedar Falls sat in the heart of Iowa corn country, about 90 miles northeast of Des Moines, where the Cedar River wound through fertile farmland that had supported the same families for generations. The town had been founded in 1845 by German immigrants who'd been drawn by the promise of rich soil and religious freedom. By 1958, it was home to just over 2,800 people, most of whom could trace their families back to those original settlers. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where doors were rarely locked, and where the biggest excitement was usually the Friday night high school basketball games. The winter of 1958 had been particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping to 20 below zero and snowdrifts that reached the second-story windows of some houses. The cold had driven people indoors early and kept them there, creating an isolation that made the town feel even smaller and more vulnerable than usual. Eleanor Henderson had been a pillar of the community for over 4 decades. She'd taught 3rd grade at Cedar Falls Elementary for 37 years, had been the church organist at St. Luke's Lutheran for even longer, and had raised 3 children who'd all moved away to bigger cities after the war. Since her husband's death in 1954, she'd lived alone in the modest 2-story house on Maple Street where she'd spent her entire married life. She was known for her kindness, her sharp mind, and her involvement in every charitable organization in town. She was also known for her routine. She went to bed every night at exactly 10:30 p.m. after listening to the news on her radio and saying her prayers. The idea that someone would call her at nearly midnight was almost unthinkable, which is what made the events of February 12, 1958, so shocking to everyone who knew her.
The call came at 11:47 p.m., just as Eleanor was finishing her evening prayers. The phone's shrill ring cut through the silence of the house like a knife, startling her from her devotions. Later, investigators would piece together what happened next from the evidence left behind and the testimony of her neighbor, Mrs. Ruth Kowalski.
Ruth Kowalski lived next door and had been suffering from insomnia since her own husband's recent diagnosis with cancer. She'd been sitting by her bedroom window, unable to sleep, when she'd heard the phone ringing in the Henderson house. What struck her as odd was that the ringing stopped after just a few rings, not the usual pattern of someone letting it ring until the person answered or gave up. "I saw Eleanor's kitchen light come on," Ruth would later tell Sheriff William Murphy. That was unusual because Eleanor never used the kitchen after supper. She always said it was wasteful to heat more than one room at night. About 10 minutes later, Ruth had heard what sounded like something heavy falling in the Henderson house. She'd considered going over to check, but the bitter cold and her natural reluctance to interfere in a neighbor's business had kept her at her window, watching and worrying. It wasn't until she saw that the kitchen light was still on at 2 a.m. that Ruth had finally decided to investigate. She'd thrown on her coat and boots and trudged through the snow to the Henderson house, where she'd found the back door unlocked, something that would have been completely out of character for Eleanor. Inside, she'd found Eleanor Henderson lying on the kitchen floor, dressed in her nightgown and robe, with the telephone receiver still clutched in her hand. She was already cold to the touch, and her face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. Sheriff Murphy had arrived within 15 minutes of Ruth's frantic call, followed shortly by Dr. James Peterson, the town's only physician. Dr. Peterson's initial examination suggested that Eleanor had died of a heart attack, probably brought on by shock or extreme fear. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, no indication that anyone else had been in the house, Sheriff Murphy would later write in his report. Mrs. Henderson appeared to have died from natural causes, though the circumstances were highly unusual. But it was the telephone that provided the first clue to what had really happened. When Sheriff Murphy examined the phone, he found that the receiver had been placed back on the hook properly, but Eleanor was found with it clutched in her hand. This suggested that someone had called her. She answered, and then the shock of whatever she'd heard had literally killed her. Dr. Peterson confirmed that Eleanor had indeed died of cardiac arrest, but he was puzzled by the timing and circumstances. He explained, "Mrs. Henderson was 77 years old, but she was in remarkably good health for her age. She'd been my patient for 12 years, and while she had some minor heart irregularities, nothing that would suggest she was at risk for a sudden fatal attack."
The mystery of Eleanor Henderson's death might have remained unsolved if it hadn't been for what happened 3 nights later. At 11:52 p.m. on February 15th, the phone rang in the home of Walter Bergman, a 73-year-old retired farmer who lived alone on the outskirts of town. Walter had been a widower for 6 years and was known throughout Cedar Falls for his robust health and independent spirit. He chopped his own wood, maintained his own property, and regularly walked the 3 miles into town for supplies. Unlike Eleanor Henderson, Walter survived his midnight phone call, but just barely. The next morning, Walter's son Robert found him sitting in his kitchen, pale and shaking, staring at the telephone with a look of absolute terror. Walter told his son that someone had called him in the middle of the night and said, "You're next, old man. Death is coming for you." He was in shock, Robert would later tell Sheriff Murphy.
Dad's always been tough as nails, but this had shaken him to his core. He kept saying that the voice didn't sound natural, that it was like something from a nightmare. Walter was taken to Dr. Peterson, who found that the elderly man's blood pressure had spiked dangerously high and his heart was racing. If Mr. Bergman had been in weaker health, this call might have killed him, just like it apparently killed Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Peterson observed. Sheriff Murphy now had a pattern. 2 elderly residents living alone, both receiving threatening phone calls late at night, both suffering severe physical reactions to the calls. He immediately began investigating the possibility that someone was systematically targeting the town's most vulnerable residents. His investigation revealed that both Eleanor Henderson and Walter Bergman had been on a list of residents who received regular check-ins from the town's volunteer welfare program, a list that included the names, addresses, and phone numbers of every elderly person living alone in Cedar Falls. 2 nights later, the pattern continued. At 11:55 p.m. on February 17th, Mrs. Agatha Zimmerman, an 81-year-old widow, received a call. This time, however, Mrs. Zimmerman had been expecting it.
Sheriff Murphy had convinced several of the elderly residents on the welfare list to let him install extra phone lines in their homes, connected to the sheriff's office. When Mrs. Zimmerman's phone rang that night, Sheriff Murphy was listening on the extension. What he heard chilled him to the bone. The voice was deep, distorted, and filled with malice. "Your time is running out, Agatha," it said. "Soon you'll join the others in the cold ground." But Sheriff Murphy had been prepared for this moment. He'd arranged for the phone company to trace any calls to the monitored numbers, and within minutes of the call ending, he had the location. The calls were coming from inside the Cedar Falls Telephone Exchange building. The discovery that the calls were originating from the phone company's own equipment added a new dimension to the mystery. Someone with access to the telephone exchange was using the system to terrorize the town's elderly residents. But who had such access, and why were they targeting these particular people? Sheriff Murphy immediately contacted Harold Weiss, the manager of the Cedar Falls Telephone Exchange. Harold had been with the company for 15 years and knew every piece of equipment in the building. He was shocked by the revelation that his facility was being used for the harassment calls. "Only 3 people have keys to the building," Harold explained. "Myself, my assistant manager, Tom Crawford, and the night maintenance man, Eddie Larson. We also have a new trainee, but she only works during the day shift." Sheriff Murphy's investigation into the 3 men with building access revealed interesting information about each of them. Harold Weiss was above suspicion. He was a pillar of the community, married with 3 children, and had no reason to terrorize elderly residents. Tom Crawford was younger, single, and had moved to Cedar Falls from Chicago just 6 months earlier. Eddie Larson was a local man who'd worked for the phone company for 8 years, but had been acting strangely lately.
The investigation took a dramatic turn when Sheriff Murphy discovered that Eddie Larson's grandmother had been one of the people on the welfare checklist and that she had died just 3 weeks earlier, apparently of natural causes.
Eddie Larson was 43 years old, unmarried, and had lived his entire life in Cedar Falls. He'd cared for his grandmother, Martha Larson, for the past 5 years after she'd suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. Martha had been his only living relative, and her death had left him completely alone. When Sheriff Murphy questioned Eddie about his grandmother's death, however, he discovered something troubling. Martha Larson had died on the same night she'd received a disturbing phone call from someone claiming to be from the welfare office, telling her that her benefits were being canceled and that she would have to move to the county poorhouse. Eddie was devastated, Dr. Peterson recalled. He insisted that the stress of that phone call had killed his grandmother. He kept saying that someone had murdered her with words, that whoever made that call was responsible for her death. Eddie's grief had quickly turned to rage, and he'd become obsessed with finding out who had made the call to his grandmother. His investigation had led him to the welfare office, where he'd learned about the list of elderly residents and begun to suspect that someone was systematically targeting vulnerable people. But instead of reporting his suspicions to the authorities, Eddie had decided to take justice into his own hands. Using his access to the telephone exchange, he'd begun making his own threatening calls to the people on the welfare list, believing that he could expose the original caller by creating panic and forcing them to reveal themselves. "I wanted to scare them the way they scared my grandmother," Eddie confessed when Sheriff Murphy finally confronted him. "I thought if I made them afraid, the real killer would have to show himself. I thought I could make them understand what it felt like to be terrorized." But Eddie's plan had backfired tragically. Instead of exposing the original caller, he'd created new victims. Eleanor Henderson had died from the shock of his call, and several other elderly residents had been hospitalized with stress-related conditions. The final twist in the Cedar Falls mystery came when Sheriff Murphy investigated the original call that had supposedly killed Eddie's grandmother. Working with the telephone company's records, he discovered that no such call had ever been made from the welfare office or any other official agency. The truth was much simpler and more tragic than anyone had imagined. Martha Larson had received a wrong number call on the night she died, a call intended for someone else entirely. The caller had been a bill collector looking for a different Martha Larson in the next county, and the conversation had been about overdue payments on a furniture purchase. Martha Larson, already in poor health and confused by her stroke, had misunderstood the conversation and believed that she was indeed losing her benefits. The shock and worry had triggered the heart attack that killed her. There had been no conspiracy, no systematic targeting of elderly residents, just a tragic misunderstanding that had cost an innocent woman her life. Eddie Larson had created an elaborate conspiracy theory to explain his grandmother's death because he couldn't accept that she died from something as random and meaningless as a wrong number call. His grief had transformed into paranoia, and his desire for justice had turned him into the very thing he thought he was fighting against. Eddie Larson was charged with harassment and involuntary manslaughter in the death of Eleanor Henderson. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he served only 3 due to his previously clean record and the sympathy of the court for his grief-driven actions. The town of Cedar Falls slowly recovered from the winter of fear, though the events of 1958 changed the community forever. People began locking their doors at night, and many elderly residents had their phone numbers changed to unlisted numbers. The easy trust that had once characterized the town was replaced by a more cautious wariness. Dr. Peterson established a program to provide better mental health support for grieving residents, recognizing that Eddie's case had shown how isolation and unprocessed grief could transform ordinary people into dangerous ones. The welfare check program was expanded to include more frequent visits and better training for volunteers. Harold Weiss instituted new security measures at the telephone exchange, ensuring that building access was more tightly controlled and that all after-hours activity was properly logged and monitored. He also worked with Sheriff Murphy to establish protocols for tracing harassing phone calls more quickly. Eddie Larson was released from prison in 1961 and left Cedar Falls immediately, moving to California where he found work as a telephone repairman. He never returned to Iowa, though he did send a letter to the Henderson family, apologizing for his actions and expressing his remorse for Eleanor's death. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of grief-driven vigilantism and the importance of proper mental health support in small communities. It also highlighted how modern technology, in this case the telephone system, could be used as a weapon by those who understood its capabilities. Perhaps most tragically, the Cedar Falls Midnight Caller case of 1958 showed how a single misunderstanding could cascade into multiple tragedies, demonstrating that sometimes the most dangerous mysteries are not about who committed a crime, but about why ordinary people convince themselves that violence is the only solution to their pain. The phones still ring in Cedar Falls on cold winter nights, but now when elderly residents answer, they hear the voices of children and grandchildren calling to check on them, of neighbors making sure they're safe, of a community that learned to care for its vulnerable members before grief and isolation could transform love into something dark and destructive. And so concludes another chapter in our Small Town Secrets series, where the quiet streets of America's heartland reveal that sometimes the most frightening mysteries are born not from malice, but from love twisted by grief and isolation. The Cedar Falls Midnight Caller case of 1958 reminds us that, in our rush to find meaning in tragedy, we sometimes create new tragedies of our own. Join us next time as we explore another forgotten corner of small-town America, where the past whispers its secrets to those brave enough to listen. Until then, remember that the most important calls we can make are the ones that connect us to each other, bridging the distances that grief and fear try to create between us.